it's a wicked problem. There's a lot of things contributing to, what we're seeing on the ground in terms of student engagement, in terms of behavior, in terms of test scores, in terms of teacher retention. The scientific literature is pretty much in consensus around the fact that the more physical activity we do simply as human beings, the healthier we are. Physical activity and the fun that comes from it has the potential to influence students' psychological changes, their engagement in and outside of the classroom. How we've been teaching math isn't working.
Hello, and welcome back to the Math and Movement podcast. In our first episode, we talked about why movement matters and how it can transform the way students experience math. Today, we're taking that conversation a step further and diving into the science behind why movement-based learning works. I'm excited to be joined by Kirby Schoephoerster, Senior Program Director at the National Math Foundation. The National Math Foundation has been an organizational partner with Math and Movement for over a decade, and more recently, Kirby and his team have been researching how movement-based learning supports math fluency, engagement, and student confidence. Kirby, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Suzy. Thanks for having me.
To start, can you introduce yourself and share a little bit about your role and the work you do with movement-based learning?
Yes, so I'm the Senior Program Director at the National Math Foundation. As you said, the foundation's been an organizational partner with Math and Movement, with you for over a decade now. We use Math and Movement resources in many of our programs at the foundation, and we work with schools and community partners across the country to provide them with effective multisensory math sources like those of Math and Movement. But more recently, we've been conducting research using Math and Movement resources in classroom and district level contexts in an effort to really better understand that nuanced relationship between physical activity and student learning, and really how teachers can best implement movement-based learning strategies in their classrooms.
Great. So, what was your personal experience with math when you were growing up?
So I was actually in the minority of students at my school when it came to understanding and doing math. I was very lucky in that I was able to make sense of math and do well in math using the more, traditional methods of worksheets and textbooks and quizzes. I was also pretty lucky in that my class was a relatively high achieving group of students, and we really pushed one another to do well academically. But the rest of the grades at my school and many other students didn't have that kind of support. I grew up in a really small rural town. And if I recall correctly, my graduating class was around 50 kids. So I knew most of them
Oh,
since I was little. And my experience with math was really shaped by that small, close-knit community and was relatively positive, really because I understood, the content itself. But I really would say that the reason that I excelled at that age was a combination of support from that close-knit friend group, my family, the teachers, and that the material itself just made sense to me in the way that it was delivered. But with that being said, I never really fostered a passion for math, and as a result, I would argue, didn't pursue it beyond high school in any meaningful way.
tell the audience a little bit about your background, what you studied in college and graduate school, and also, why did you want to join the National Math Foundation?
So my journey to where I am now as the senior program director is pretty unorthodox. I fell in love with languages while I was in high school, particularly Spanish. And when I entered college, I was interested in, continuing to pursue that subject, but also interconnect that with my interests in history, mythology, All the things that a small rural boy found particularly interested in his sort of isolated small Missouri town. And I ended up pursuing classical studies, so ancient Latin, ancient Greek languages, and a little bit of archaeology. So that's what I did for most of my time in undergrad and what I pursued during my graduate school, my master's program. And I fell in love with this subject or this field because of how interdisciplinary and interconnected all the subjects were when we talked about these ancient languages. And really I would say, increased my passion, fostered my passion for education more generally. But I realized after my graduate program in classical studies that I didn't want to be a professor of classics.
Mhm.
So I joined the National Math Foundation really in an effort to give back to the kinds of teachers that supported me through my own upbringing, realizing that, so many other students hadn't, you know, at my age received, the kind of care and ongoing support that I had received that really inspired in me a passion for lifelong learning. So I felt that the National Math Foundation gave me an opportunity to bring my translation skills, bring all of these interdisciplinary skills and passions, to the forefront of work with teachers and classrooms.
It's a great background. And I love it that
Thank
you
you.
studied classical Greek because when I was in college, I took a class called Suicide Greek, and I
Mm.
absolutely loved it. It was 2 semesters of Greek crammed into one semester. And I just fell in love with classical Greek. So that's so cool.
It was difficult. I started with Latin and transitioned into Greek. And it wasn't until I got into college that I realized that many of my peers had taken those languages while in middle and high school. I didn't even know that was a possibility. So that was pretty eye-opening for me, as a learner of these ancient languages to realize that there were schools across the country that were, instructing students in this really fascinating, history. Because so much of what we, use in our modern English lexicon can, comes from ancient Latin and Greek, and just kind of piecing
Right.
those, things together was very interesting to me.
And there's just so much more we can do with education. And when we facilitate the process of learning, so kids start learning faster and retaining more, we can do so much more, like, include classical languages. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, it's really exciting. I mean, I see the future of education very positively. I see that AI is going to take away some of the menial work that we've had to do and open us up for broadening us and giving us so many more opportunities. So I just love it that you studied classical languages.
I appreciate that. And since you mentioned that, Susie, what initially came to mind, as you were bringing that up and thinking back on my own classical studies program, and I think is pretty connected to, the topic of today and the work that I do now with movement-based mathematics at the National Math Foundation. You know, I one of the reasons, looking back on that experience in grad school, one of the reasons that I feel that I, didn't feel sort of as much of a fit in the career trajectory of becoming a classics professor was you know, how little hands-on application of the language, was afforded to me in my own education through it. My professors were amazing. And again, kind of keeping that, you know, that instructional tradition alive of what I excelled at before, the textbooks, the worksheets, the quizzes I've always been able to, do well with. So I did well with that type of instruction with Latin. And it wasn't until my graduate program that I realized that, you could learn active Latin, that there was spoken Latin, and that you could do the types of hands-on, inclusive work that you would do in a Spanish classroom that is a spoken language, a living language. You could do that with a language like Latin or ancient Greek, which are considered dead languages. And that just kind of blew my mind that, and it made sense to me too, that, the power of that hands-on learning, that practice, that living, that, moving is very impactful to not just our own understanding of the languages, but also our passion and seeing it as an applicable thing, bringing abstract ideas into reality, that hands-on work really, you know, assists with that, I feel.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So now let me ask. So, for listeners who are newer to this conversation, can you explain what the science tells us about movement-based learning and why it works?
So it's pretty common knowledge, and the scientific literature is pretty much in consensus around the fact that the more physical activity we do simply as human beings, the healthier we are. And there's a ton of evidence showing that increased physical activity supports both the development of the body and the brain in both young and older people. But what's especially interesting to us at the National Math Foundation, and really what informs our programming, is how movement, or really how we classify increased physical activity opportunities, affects the learning process. I kind of want to offer three perspectives here. So, from a neuroscience perspective, as we're physically active, that is aerobically active, so our heart rate is increasing. And as we move across our body's midline while we're aerobically active, the neural networks in our brain are strengthened. And those movements, when they're done consistently, increase our physical fitness, our balance, our muscle memory. But those same neural connections made by our physical movements can also be used for information processing. So, what that means is physical activity helps to create the kinds of pathways in our brain to be able to process the kind of information we learn in the classroom, for example, like math facts or literacy concepts. Why this is the case is really the result of a number of different chemicals that our brain produces when we're active, like dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. So the second perspective I want to offer is a learning science one, and a multi-sensory approach to classroom instruction, which is an approach that incorporates as many of a learner's senses as possible, has been proven to be highly effective in helping people of all ages, but especially young learners, help them attain and retain information. And the third perspective I want to share is that social emotional one. This idea that movement is fun for most people, especially younger students. And researchers have found that physical activity and the fun that comes from it, aside from its impacts on academic achievement, has the potential to influence students' psychological changes, their engagement in and outside of the classroom, and also their social interactions and social development. A movement-based learning approach is one that really prioritizes collaboration and engagement right alongside those high expectations for achievement, which supports so many different aspects of students' development, health-wise, physiologically, and social emotionally.
That's such a great way to answer that question and share that information. And it really goes along with all the great authors that I've read over the years. Dr. John Rady in Spark, The Revolutionary New Science of Exercise in the Brain, and Dr. John Medina in Brain Rules, just to name a few. So it's just really, I always just think it's just so amazing to combine the theory and the practice. We know from the theory what works, but then just to be able to put it in action is really, really great. So you've talked about what happens in the brain during movement. Can you explain for our audience the role BDNF plays in learning and why that matters for students?
I'm glad you actually brought up John Rady, because John Rady is kind of critical in the popularization of BDNF, especially for educators and lay people outside of the neuroscience space. So BDNF, also called or spelled out brain-derived neurotrophic factor, is a chemical that our brains naturally produce. BDNF acts as a natural buffer to the hormone cortisol. And cortisol is a hormone that our brain creates in moments of elevated stress as a result response to trauma, elevated toxic levels of stress. And cortisol eats away at the neural connections in our brain as it sort of prepares the body and the brain itself for flight, fight, or freeze responses to perceived stressors. In a classroom setting, high and sustained levels of cortisol are extremely dangerous to learners, especially for students who live with elevated toxic levels of cortisol in their brains, who've experienced copious, adversity. BDNF, on the other hand, can be thought of as miracle grow for the brain, which was popularized, this phrase was popularized by Dr. John Rady back, if I recall, Suzy, in the mid 2000s or so.
Right.
And not only does BDNF strengthen pre-existing neural connections, but it also supports the growth of new connections and networks in the brain, making it a direct buffer or counter to the damaging effects of cortisol. But what's so exciting about BDNF in the context of movement-based learning, in the context of what you and I do at the individual level, is that when we engage in vigorous physical exercise, that aerobic exercise, our brain creates a surplus of BDNF. That means the more our students are physically active and get their heart rates up, the more BDNF their brains produce, and the stronger their neural networks are capable of becoming, more resilient to the effects of cortisol. That's especially significant for our students with high stress levels or students who faced adversity. But in terms of classroom design, BDNF production, I would argue, matters quite a bit or has the potential to matter quite a bit for educators, especially for math educators, whose discipline has, the discipline of math has historically been rife with anxiety, stress, and adversity. We can actually design for increased BDNF production in the math classroom by creating what researchers have called enriched environments. And what makes an environment enriched is this combination of sensory and learning engagement, social interaction, and physical activity opportunities. So, put differently, when we provide students with consistent sensory and learning engagement, when we provide them with constant social interaction opportunities and also copious opportunities to be physically active in the math classroom, for example, we're offering them an enriched environment that supports the surplus production of BDNF, which in turn regulates everyone's brains and supports everyone's physical, social, emotional, and academic development. And this is kind of my ongoing call to action to math teachers and curriculum directors and designers of classrooms. I believe that every math classroom can be an enriched environment. Getting there, of course, is no simple task, but it's a task that the National Math Foundation is committed to accomplishing.
Yeah, it's just really, really exciting about this idea of creating, specifically intentionally creating an enriched environment
Yep.
and how we can do this with movement. And I want to add to that how much kids flourish in these environments. They love it. And so all of that, we know from the brain science how important it is, but then, we have the buy-in from the students that just makes it, you know, that adds to all of this and makes it so amazing.
Definitely. And the flourishing is cyclical too, Susie. When students are flourishing in these enriched environments, they tend to stay in those types of high BDNF surplus production environments. And the teachers soak that flourishing in just as much as students do. And through emotional contagion, the joy that teachers feel trickles down to their students, consciously and subconsciously. So when we get in these sort of flourishing moods, these behaviors, we tend to stay in them. And of course, the opposite side is true. If we don't, learn or work within, live within an enriched learning environment, it's much more difficult for us to, you know, turn that cycle around to something more positive, ergo the need for interventions. So yes, that flourishing is infectious, really.
And add to that that the students go home and they tell their parents
Yep.
how excited they are,
Yep.
and then their parents are really excited and they want to be more involved. So it's just, it's just a beautiful cycle. All right, so Kirby, you've been involved in research on movement-based learning. So what have you and your team found when it comes to math fluency and student attitudes?
Mhm. Okay, so far at the National Math Foundation, I've been involved in a few research projects related to how movement or the, supplement of a movement-based math program impacts students' math fluency as well as their math attitudes, really specific to multiplication, at least starting out. So in terms of fluency, we've been very interested in how movement affects students' ability to acquire and retain math facts and procedures, such as, memorizing multiples and efficiently recalling them during tests, for example. But we're also interested in how movement affects students' conceptual understanding, how and when it's appropriate to apply specific math strategies like multiplication or division to solve specific math problems. And it's really a combination of both of these things that are interconnected that contribute to students' overall fluency. We need both. In terms of attitudes, we want students and their teachers to have what are called positive attitudes towards math. And based on the literature, we at the foundation have conceptualized math attitudes as a sort of three factor concepts. Our attitudes are influenced by three interconnected things. The first is, do students enjoy math? Are they engaged? Do they have fun? The second is, do students feel confident in their ability to do math? And thirdly, do students see math as valuable? Are they motivated to continue to pursue it? Do they see that the tasks that they're engaging in are worth it and enjoyable enough to continue to pursue it? Do they see it as applicable? All of us fall on a spectrum within those three factors, but our overall attitude towards math is influenced by our answers to these questions, so they can shift and they shift often. So we need to work diligently to support students' development of these positive math attitudes because we know how powerful those are in affecting students' overall math achievement and their test scores. So that means students need to enjoy their math, they need to feel confident in their math skills, and they need to see math as a discipline that's valuable, that's practical, and that's applicable in the real world or the world outside of school if they're really to engage fully in math tasks. And the research that I've conducted at the foundation in collaboration with so many powerhouse partners in higher education, we found that a movement-based approach to math instruction is highly effective in supporting or enriching students' math fluency and math attitudes. We recently published articles in a couple peer-reviewed journals, one being Mathematical Thinking and Learning, and the other being The Professional Educator. We've presented on this topic, we've published on this topic, and our study found that at both the classroom and district levels, there was a significant relationship between physical activity and student learning outcomes related to both their multiplication fluency and their attitudes towards multiplication. Specifically, students who participated in a movement-based multiplication intervention, which functioned really as a supplement to the math curricula that the school was already implementing. Students who participated in that intervention showed higher test scores and higher self-confidence and self-efficacy ratings pertaining to multiplication than the students who didn't engage in that type of intervention.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And those articles that those journals you published in are really hard to, I think, what, like a 7% acceptance rate?
I believe so, something like that for the mathematical thinking and
They're
learning.
really, really careful with what they publish. Can you share an example of the kind of data you've seen in action, especially from real-world classrooms using movement-based learning?
Yeah, of course. So One project that I'd like to highlight here is a 10-day movement multiplication intervention that took place in Sarasota, Florida, which was facilitated in partnership with Math and Movement a few years ago. So for 10 days, a group of third graders, a third grade classroom, participated in a movement-based math intervention that was designed to strengthen these students' multiplication scores and boost their math attitudes. So from pre-tests to post-tests, the third grade students saw, on average, an improvement of around 89% in their multiplication test scores. We also saw that the performance gap between highest and lowest achieving students in the class decrease from 53% to just 10% after these 10 days of instruction. This data is especially exciting to me because not only do we see significant, positive changes from pre-test to post-test average scores, but we also see, a positive trend line across average pre-test scores as students progressed through their individual multiples. Most students tend to find higher multiples like sevens, eights, and nines to be particularly challenging. So one would normally expect to see, students performing a little bit worse on their pre-tests compared to earlier ones for these multiples. But in this particular project, we actually saw the opposite. So on average, students did better on their pre-tests with those higher multiples than they did with smaller ones. And my hypothesis here is that how movement-based instruction was implemented had a compounding effect on student test scores because it helped students learn how to learn multiplication. So if I were to put this a little differently, when students faced these new multiples or new problems, they had already secured the skills, they were already engaged, and they were confident in their skills to tackle these new multiples, through that active participation and practice with the earlier ones in this movement-based way. So by the time they reached their nines, they had already become familiar with and excited about, how they're going to learn this new material. So it set them up early for excitement and success. And they saw that in their pre-tests when they were introduced to these new multiples, these higher multiples.
Yeah, that was such an amazing program. The one that you're talking about. It was, to see it firsthand and to see the students become so engaged and their self-efficacy just skyrocket. It was pretty amazing.
Yes.
And I actually have a little something to add to that, which is incredible. So I went recently, like within the last couple of weeks, I went back to the school and I got to meet this amazing young man, like see him again. And when I had first started to work with him within this program, what I had learned that he just really had not been engaged at all. And I saw such a change in him over that 2 week period of time. I share the story a lot. And so then a couple of weeks ago, I saw him and talked with him, and he remembered the program. He smiled
Oh,
at me.
wow.
He said, "Oh, that's when I learned multiplication." And the administration shared that that was like the turning point for this kiddo. And the school since then has done so much to support him. And
Wonderful.
and now he is on track for doing really, really well. Isn't that
Wow.
just the most amazing news?
Yeah, and that's one of the exciting things about, the research in this field is that there really isn't a lot out there about the longitudinal effects of this rigorous movement-based, supplement and enrichment work. And that's what's very exciting for me in my position here at the foundation is, I want to connect with researchers and community partners and schools to really, put some data behind these wonderful experiences that, are being shared, with you and other educators on the ground who are instructing teachers, and sharing all these different movement-based math strategies. We see it in our conversations. We hear it from students themselves, from teachers, from administrators. But what it sounds like he's flourishing, and I just can't wait to hear how that flourishing continues to roll out for him, and how this experience with movement at that age was so impactful for him, that it almost flipped a switch or
Right,
helped guide
right,
him on a path towards success and ongoing support. There's so
right.
much to learn, and it's just so exciting to hear that.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so let's think about the bigger picture. So looking at the bigger picture, where do you think movement-based learning fits in the future of education? Could it be a part of the solution schools are looking for right now? So let me add to that. In my conversations, what I'm hearing from educators is that sometimes now they're just saying, "Whoa, technology, too much, too much. Let's put a stop on this. We don't want kids on screens all day long." So could this be then a solution for schools now that are realizing that kids are not making their students are not making the progress they want them to make, but could we do something different? Could we use movement?
Mm-hmm. And that's a big question, Susie, and the problem that we face, as educators, as funders of educational projects, as community partners, it's a wicked problem. There's a lot of things contributing to, what we're seeing on the ground in terms of student engagement, in terms of behavior, in terms of test scores, in terms of teacher retention, in terms of chronic absenteeism. Um, and of course, I'm biased here in my position, but it's really become evident to me and to the teachers and the leaders that I've connected with these past few years that, how we're currently teaching math and supporting math students, how we've been teaching math isn't working. And it isn't working for every student, which is really what we're aiming for, especially at the National Math Foundation. We want every student to experience success and get to grade level in math and reading. Students' test scores in the US are at historic lows, and the promising signs of improvement are really only coming from the historically high achieving ones. And students, teachers, and parents have really become disillusioned with how math as a discipline has been portrayed in curricula and also instructed in the classroom. And what's most apparent, at least from the teachers that I've had the privilege of working with over the past few years, is that students really aren't engaged in math, and they struggle to enjoy participating in math tasks, and they struggle to see math's applicability, its practicality to the real world. And this disengagement only increases as students get older. And all of this affects their motivation to learn, their, ability, capacity to engage, and ultimately, their ability to succeed in math and graduate. Interestingly, a relatively recent survey, which was funded, supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they found that 60% of parents surveyed across racial demographic groups said that they believe their child would be more likely to excel in math class if it was more relevant and engaging. Also, 61% of parents that were surveyed said math education should ideally be relevant to the real world, but only 21% would use that phrase to describe what their child's math education is actually like. So there's a gap there in the understanding the need and what's actually happening. So in short, we're facing a math fluency and identity crisis that reflects, these test scores, these low test scores, this low valuation of math as a discipline, and this high prevalence of math anxiety that's coming from all these different directions, from students themselves internally, from society writ large, from parents, and even some math educators. I believe, and again, biased here, that movement-based learning offers students and teachers, and also parents too, a way or really a method to re-engage with math in a way that gives learners opportunities to have fun while simultaneously building those skills, and that confidence and really a sense of value around the subject. I don't believe that movement-based education is a fix to the systemic problems that are at play, but I do believe it's an effective way, an effective path, a method to shift the scales and afford students opportunities to experience success, which can be replicated across so many different learning contexts. So not only does movement get students really of all ages excited about the math content, but at the physiological level, it helps regulate and strengthen students' brains in the face of ongoing stressors and trauma that they're experiencing day to day. And as we continue working to, redesign these, inequitable educational systems, I believe that the movement-based approach offers an evidence-based pathway for reframing math instruction in a way that's more accessible, in a way that's easily implementable across such a wide variety of learning contexts.
All right. So, Kirby, you also lead workshops and presentations with
Yes.
educators. What do you notice when teachers get to experience movement-based learning for themselves?
Well, the first thing that I notice just is enjoyment. Usually shows up as smiles, but also comments like, I wish I had this as a kid. I wish, I learned math in this way. But as we get into the implementation side of movement-based math instruction, it's really the creativity that teachers bring to the table that begins to shine. And, the beauty of movement-based learning in this context is that learners of all ages, even adult educators, benefit from it. Nobody really enjoys sitting in their seats from
Right.
4 to 6 hours a day, much less all day. But what I love hearing from teachers who participate in our movement-based learning, professional development offerings, our workshops, is how excited they are to immediately begin applying our tools and our resources into their classrooms. And there really is a palpable sense of excitement and urgency to start practicing and putting these, resources and strategies to work and getting feedback from their students. So that excitement quickly spreads. I've noticed through my years working in this position that excitement spreads pretty quickly across all levels of a school district, especially when district leaders have a chance to participate in those workshops alongside teachers and
Mhm.
understand the value of, evidence-based supports, supplements, and curricula that just get kids to practice more hands-on math.
That's the best.
Yeah.
Whenever I've had a workshop and it's a principal and his or her team come to the workshop, it they get all excited together, they collaborate, they
Yep.
talk about it, and then I hear back how they've brought that excitement back to their school. I 100% agree. When you have principals, going to the PDs with their teachers, that makes just such a big difference.
hmm I also noticed, in these trainings with teachers, their willingness to collaborate, their, willingness to ask questions and explore really increases when, we kind of add movement to the equation of professional learning. And I really try my best to create opportunities for educators to work together in these spaces to come up with activity ideas and adapt these ideas for, their diverse, student learner population. But that creativity and collaboration really happens naturally when both teachers and students are given the chance to just move around, handle the materials and, engage in these types of activities themselves. So you really get to see, the collective efficacy develop during these movement-based professional learning events. And I do think that, the excitement of encountering and using these, say, movement-based tools creates a collective engagement that snowballs. It snowballs into positive, highly proactive teaching behaviors. Teachers are very aware of this, and they often they've shared with me their own experience, exploring these resources and these strategies, and in sharing with me how easy it was to translate that learning and those experiences into a classroom setting. So for those who are listening, if you haven't had a chance to participate in a, moving and learning math workshop, I would highly recommend doing so. It's a fun, exciting, highly energized time.
I think we should share with the audience the absolutely amazing, exciting news about our book that
Mm.
has now been published through ASCD. So, Kirby, go ahead and just share a little bit about Activate Math.
Yes, so activate math, using movement to, spark engagement and ignite learning is a project that you and I, Susie, have been, collaborating on for many a years now. And it's been such a joy because I feel that, after all these years of working with teachers, working with administrators, working with schools, gathering data, synthesizing the research, we've come to a point where we can comprehensively package, the why behind what we do. Why is it important that students are up and out of their seats and moving their bodies as they're learning math? And that's really the purpose of this book, is to provide teachers, to provide those who, design math instruction curricula, who, are actively involved with students and teacher professional learning, provide that audience, provide those people with a comprehensive overview of the science behind movement-based learning, the evidence, for its efficacy, but also provide them with, immediate movement-based games, activities. And I believe there are 45 currently in the book that you can just start implementing in your school to get kids up and moving, to develop those habits of movement. And, this is, an avenue that I'd like to investigate further from the research perspective. But really, what we want to do at the National Math Foundation is, create spaces that allow these habits of movement to take shape. And that is such a, complex process that involves, strong instructional teacher relationships, that involve, growth beliefs, that are asset framed rather than deficit framing of student accomplishment, that are joyous, that allow teachers opportunities to, pass along their joy and engagement to their students. And I think this book does a good job of sort of comprehensively packaging that for teachers. And I believe is the first step in a long, series of projects that get to this nuanced understanding of physical activity and math achievement that we believe in. This belief that when we're up and moving, we do better at math, and this book, I think, sets a good stage for the why and offers some examples, some games, some ideas of how we can implement these learnings into the classroom. So, really bridging research and practice around movement-based learning is what I'm most proud about regarding this work.
Right, the why and the how.
Yep.
And why would what argument would you give for decision makers to think about why they would want to include Activate Math as one of the books for their PLCs starting in the fall of 2026?
I mean, firstly, it's research based. It's this book was years of, research synthesis, organizing, and making sense of really all the studies that are out there on the concept of movement-based math and how physical activity impacts learning. So, if you're looking to build, collective efficacy and urgency around change, if you notice that your students aren't, improving in their math test scores, I feel that incorporating this book into your PLCs really sparks conversation around, well, what alternative ways can we engage students in these math tasks? We have a curriculum that's in place that we have to follow. That tends to be the case. But following this curriculum to the T might not be yielding the type of outcomes, we want to see. We still see high levels of chronic absenteeism. We still see low levels of engagement. We still see a lack of confidence. The test scores might be getting better, but the identity of students and their interest and motivation to participate sustainably just isn't there. Well, this movement-based approach is an alternative way, and it's a method, it's a framework. It's not designed to undermine, we didn't present this as, an alternative, you know, option to teach that undermines what you're already doing. We provide two frameworks in this book. One framework is instructor facing, and the other framework is instruction facing. And these frameworks are meant to function as a lens through which we can make sense of student and teachers' experiences with math instruction. And when we incorporate this into a PD, it brings to light a lot of, assumptions that we hadn't typically hadn't thought about before, because many teachers, through their pre-service experience, aren't introduced or formally taught how to engage students in a more movement-based, active way, especially outside of, special education or early childhood education contexts. So I think really it opens up the mind, provides a lot of questions, and gets teachers and school communities to really think about, well, what do our students really need to succeed? And are there ways, cheap ways, easy ways, fun ways to get kids to excel, regardless of the specific type of curricula that we're expected to follow at our schools? So that would be my argument, firstly, Susie.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, really, it's a great read. We've had so many educators and some really famous people review
Yes, very
the
excited
book.
about that.
And this one kindergarten teacher just said, "This is the best, book, education book that I have ever read." So that made us feel really proud.
Hmm. Very
Uh,
much so.
all right, so Kirby, thank you so much for being here and sharing both the science and the real world research behind movement-based learning. What stands out to me is that this is so much more than getting students up and moving. It's about supporting the brain, increasing confidence, improving fluency, and helping students experience success in math in a way that feels engaging and meaningful. And that matters deeply, especially at a time when so many students are disengaged and doubting their math ability. So I think this conversation has just been so meaningful and helpful. And I really appreciate you being here. So I have one last question. Can you finish this sentence? Students learn math best when,
Well, students learn math best when they're supported from every angle, not just in terms of support relationally with peers and teachers, but also support in the instruction and how that instruction is implemented.
yeah, great. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you to our listeners for being here. In our next episode, we'll continue the conversation and explore more ways movement can be used to support students and teachers in practical classroom settings. Thanks for listening to the Math and Movement podcast. Thank you for listening to the Math and Movement podcast. And a special thank you to the amazing educators around the world, making learning come alive every day. The views and opinions expressed in today's episode are those of the individuals who shared them. For books, resources, and upcoming events, visit mathandmovement.com. Keep moving, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.